My manager refused the 10% raise he'd promised me. My phone buzzed 47 times during my son's basketball practice. Most calls came from Garrett Walsh, my IT manager, a few from production supervisors. 3 from executives at Global Tech Solutions, the client who generated 60% of our manufacturing revenue. I didn't answer any of them because the network keeping their entire operation running was something I'd quietly built myself over 8 years. And for the first time since joining Bridgeport Manufacturing, I'd stopped patching their systems after hours. My name's Marcus Thompson. I'm 48 years old, been working IT infrastructure for 22 years now, 8 of those at Bridgeport. Used to be Army Signal Corps before I got into civilian tech work. Learned network protocols the hard way during deployments where downtime meant more than lost revenue. It meant lives at risk. These days, I'm the senior network engineer keeping a mid-size manufacturer's digital backbone operational. Or at least I was until last week when everything changed. That phone buzzing during Jake's practice was just the beginning. Jake's my 16-year-old son, stays with me every other weekend since the divorce 5 years ago. Kid's got a decent jump shot, reminds me of myself at that age before I discovered computers were more reliable than people. While he ran drills on the court, I watched those missed call notifications pile up and felt something I hadn't experienced since my Army days, the calm satisfaction of watching a poorly planned operation fall apart, exactly as predicted. The story really starts 4 days earlier in Bridgeport's quarterly review meeting. That's when Garrett decided I wasn't worth the raise he'd promised 6 months ago. Turns out to be the most expensive decision he made all year, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The conference room always felt too bright during these quarterly meetings. Fluorescent lights bouncing off that polished table while everyone sat straighter than usual, waiting to hear decisions that quietly shaped their paychecks. Reminded me of briefing rooms back in the service, except there the stakes were clear and the chain of command meant something. Here, corporate politics trumped competence every time. I sat about halfway down the table with my laptop closed in front of me. Garrett stood at the front flipping through slides on the wall monitor, wearing one of those expensive ties that probably cost more than most people's weekly salary. Always made me think of officers who spent more time polishing their brass than understanding their equipment. Garrett liked these meetings. Gave him an audience to perform for, just like those briefing officers who loved hearing themselves talk while the real work happened in the field. Before we wrap up the technical review, he said, adjusting his tie for the 3rd time, let's discuss compensation adjustments for Q4. A few heads turned my direction. I didn't move, I already knew what I'd been promised. 6 months back, Global Tech had nearly pulled their contract after a series of network outages crashed their production scheduling system. They were losing $30,000 per hour during downtime, the kind of bleeding that gets executives fired and departments shut down. Garrett pulled me aside after one particularly rough weekend when I'd spent 18 straight hours rebuilding their routing tables from scratch. Fix the Global Tech integration permanently, he'd said quietly, and I'll approve your 10% raise, no more emergency calls, no more weekend patches, make it bulletproof. I believed him. Reminded me of mission promises from commanding officers, accomplish the objective and the reward follows. Should have known better by then. Spent the next 4 months rebuilding their entire network infrastructure from scratch, upgraded every switch in their stack, reconfigured OSPF routing protocols for proper failover redundancy, implemented BGP peering with backup ISPs for true high availability, documented every single process with the kind of detail we used for critical communications equipment in theater. Because when something breaks at 3 a.m., you need instructions clear enough for a sleep-deprived technician to follow without making things worse. The transformation was complete. Global Tech's systems ran smoother than they had in years. Their uptime statistics improved from 97% to 99.8%. The emergency calls stopped. Weekend outages disappeared. Their operations manager even sent a formal letter praising Bridgeport's network reliability improvement. I kept a copy of that letter in my desk drawer, thinking it might matter when review time came. Now, Global Tech's production scheduling system handled 15,000 transactions per hour without a hiccup. Their automated inventory tracking processed supplier updates in real time across 6 distribution centers. The network I'd built could handle 3 times their current load with room for future expansion. Everything they needed for the next 5 years of growth, all documented and ready for handoff to junior staff. Garrett clicked to his final slide. Salary adjustments this quarter will focus on employees who demonstrated stronger leadership visibility, he announced. A few names appeared on screen. Mine wasn't one of them. Leadership visibility, corporate speak for politics over performance. One name belonged to a junior systems admin I'd trained personally 3 months ago. Kid who couldn't configure a basic VLAN without step-by-step guidance, but knew how to volunteer for visible projects during executive meetings. Another belonged to someone who joined the team 6 weeks ago and spent most meetings asking questions about systems I'd built years earlier. Across the table, Garrett avoided eye contact. Reminded me of those officers who'd promise you a commendation for completing a difficult mission, then forget about it once the crisis passed and their own evaluations looked good. The room stayed quiet. He closed the presentation without questions, no discussion period, no opportunity for feedback. I shut my laptop slowly and stood. No argument, no reaction, no military discipline cracking under corporate betrayal. Just walked out of that conference room understanding something I should have realized years ago. The systems I'd spent months stabilizing weren't really my responsibility. I'd just been the only person willing to fix them for free. I went straight to Garrett's office after the meeting ended. Door was open, him typing emails like nothing had happened. Probably updating his own performance metrics to show how well he'd managed the quarterly review process. "Got a minute?" I asked. He nodded without looking up, the kind of dismissive acknowledgement you'd give to someone interrupting important work. I stepped inside and waited while he finished typing. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, checking his Apple Watch like time was money and I was costing him both. "I wanted to follow up on the raise we discussed," I said. "You know, the global tech project." Garrett sighed like I was being unreasonable, like a soldier asking about promised leave after completing a difficult deployment. "You did solid work stabilizing that integration," he replied. "Everyone agrees on that." The pause that followed reminded me of officers who'd start compliments before delivering bad news. "But the reality is, Marcus, you're too valuable where you are." He said it like a compliment, same way commanding officers used to tell experienced sergeants they were too valuable to promote out of critical positions. "People with your institutional knowledge are hard to replace." Garrett added, "The company depends on reliable technical staff. Technical staff, not leadership, not management track. Support staff who kept things running while other people got promoted into positions where they managed the people who actually understood the work." I'd seen this pattern in the military too. The best radio operators stayed radio operators while less competent soldiers moved up to manage communications they didn't understand. I nodded once. "I see. Thanks for clarifying," I said calmly, walked out of his office and closed the door behind me. No raised voices, no arguments. Military training teaches you to maintain composure when civilians make decisions that reveal they don't understand the systems they're responsible for. Just the quiet realization that some promises were never meant to be kept. That evening, I made 2 simple decisions while driving home to pick up Jake for our weekend. First, I canceled the vacation requests I'd submitted for the following week. I'd be at work, but things would run differently. Second, I would stop performing the dozens of after-hours fixes I handled automatically without being asked. No confrontation, no dramatic resignation, just boundaries. In the Army, we called it working to standard, doing exactly what was required, nothing more. Jake noticed the change immediately when I picked him up Friday evening. "You seem different, Dad?" he said while tossing his gym bag in the back of my truck. "More relaxed or something?" I told him I was learning to set better boundaries at work. Same advice I'd been giving him about standing up to coaches who demanded too much unpaid practice time. We spent Friday night working on his physics homework at my kitchen table. Kid was struggling with electrical circuit problems, which made sense since he'd inherited my analytical mind but hadn't yet learned to trust it. I showed him how to trace current flow through parallel resistors the same way I trace network traffic through redundant paths. Everything's connected, I explained. Change one component, everything else adjusts. Understanding the system means understanding how each part affects the whole. Saturday morning, we hit the batting cages before his basketball practice. Jake had been working on his swing timing, trying to connect bat speed with ball velocity. Reminded me of troubleshooting network latency issues, multiple variables affecting a single outcome. While he took practice swings, I explained how military communications worked under pressure. "You don't fix everything," I told him. "You fix what matters most first, then work down the priority list. Some things fix themselves once you solve the critical path problems." During his basketball practice, I sat in those uncomfortable metal bleachers watching him run drills while my phone buzzed constantly in my pocket. Each notification felt like incoming fire you choose not to return. The missed calls piled up: Garrett, production supervisors, even some numbers I recognized from Global Tech's executive offices. I could picture the chaos unfolding back at Bridgeport. Network alerts triggering without automatic resolution. Routing tables updating incorrectly without my usual monitoring. Systems failing in exactly the ways I documented in my troubleshooting guides, except nobody was reading those guides. The first change had been small enough that most people barely noticed. Tuesday morning, one of our core switches started dropping packets on the Global Tech VLAN. Normally, I'd catch that within 15 minutes through monitoring alerts I'd configured personally, then fix it before anyone realized there was a problem. Instead, I forwarded the alert to our help desk with a note referencing the appropriate documentation section. Peter from production management appeared at my desk around 10:30, looking stressed in that particular way managers get when systems they don't understand start failing. "Hey Marcus," he said, "Global Tech's reporting intermittent connectivity issues. Can you take a look?" I glanced at his laptop screen. I could see the problem immediately, a simple configuration drift on switch port 23 that would take maybe 20 minutes to resolve if you knew which commands to run. "That's a switch infrastructure issue," I replied. "Help desk handles those tickets now?" Peter blinked. "Yeah, but you usually just fix it." I opened our ticket system and created a new entry, referencing the exact page in my documentation where the solution was explained in detail. "They maintain the network stack," I said. Pointing to the ticket number on his screen, Peter stared at the ticket number like it was written in a foreign language. "Oh," he said slowly, "right?" The confusion in his voice reminded me of junior officers trying to understand technical briefings about equipment they'd never actually operated. By Wednesday afternoon, the small problems had started cascading into bigger ones. Network monitoring alerts were backing up in the help desk queue because nobody else knew how to read the diagnostic output I'd spent years refining. Routing protocols were reconverging every few hours due to configuration inconsistencies I'd been manually correcting for months. The automatic failover systems worked exactly as designed, but they were failing over to backup paths that hadn't been properly load tested because nobody else understood the traffic patterns I'd been managing. Thursday afternoon brought the emergency meeting that changed everything. Global Tech's operations manager called Garrett directly, bypassing normal support channels. Their production scheduling system was generating errors every few hours. Order processing was backing up. Shipments were getting delayed because inventory updates weren't synchronizing properly across their distribution network. All problems I could have solved in my sleep. All problems documented in excruciating detail in the network architecture guides I'd created. All problems that required someone to actually read those guides and follow the procedures I'd written specifically for situations like this. But reading documentation apparently counted as someone else's responsibility. The emergency meeting felt like a combat briefing where nobody had read the intelligence reports. Garrett sat at the head of the table while Global Tech's technical team appeared on the wall monitor, their faces showing the kind of frustration that comes from dealing with unreliable infrastructure during peak production periods. "This should be fairly straightforward," Garrett said confidently to the screen, adjusting his tie like a nervous lieutenant briefing a colonel about equipment he'd never personally operated. "We'll adjust the routing configuration on our side and have this resolved within the hour." The Global Tech engineer frowned, leaning closer to his camera. "Could you clarify how your network handles failover when primary links go down? What's the reconvergence time?" I watched Garrett's expression shift from confidence to confusion, the same look I'd seen on officers' faces when technical specialists asked questions that revealed gaps in their understanding. "Well, the infrastructure automatically manages those transitions," Garrett replied, using the kind of vague corporate speak that translates to, "I have no idea how this actually works." The engineer pressed harder. "Yes, but what specific protocols control that decision? OSPF, BGP? What are your hello intervals and dead timers configured for?" Complete silence around our conference table. Nobody answered because nobody in that room except me understood what the Global Tech engineer was asking. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, like radio static during a mission briefing when communications equipment fails at the worst possible moment. Finally, Garrett's eyes landed on me with the desperation of a commanding officer realizing his technical expert might be the only person who could salvage the situation. "Marcus," he said, with forced confidence, "you've worked extensively with this network architecture. Maybe you can explain the current configuration to our partners." I looked up from my notepad where I'd been documenting the technical questions being asked, questions that had clear answers if anyone bothered to read the network documentation I'd created. "All network architecture documentation is available in the shared drive," I said calmly. "Complete implementation guides, topology diagrams, and troubleshooting procedures." Garrett opened his laptop and navigated to our documentation folder. Hundreds of files filled the screen: configuration templates, protocol specifications, failover procedures, performance baselines, all authored by me over the past 4 years, organized with the same systematic approach I'd used for maintaining communications equipment in theater. Everything labeled cross-referenced and detailed enough for competent technicians to follow without interpretation. Garrett scrolled through the files, his expression tightening with each page. The global tech engineer waited patiently while our production manager shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Someone coughed. For the first time, the people responsible for managing our largest client were realizing something they'd never considered before. The network worked reliably because one person understood it completely. And that person was sitting quietly at the far end of the table, no longer volunteering to translate technical reality into executive-friendly summaries. The global tech engineer finally broke the awkward silence. Look, we're seeing intermittent packet loss affecting our production scheduling system. Orders are backing up, shipments are getting delayed, and our inventory synchronization is failing across multiple distribution centers. This needs immediate resolution. Garrett nodded rapidly. Absolutely. Marcus will have this resolved by end of business today. The assumption in his voice reminded me of officers who promised mission completion without consulting the soldiers responsible for execution. I closed my notepad and stood. I'll review the documentation and determine the appropriate technical resource to assign this issue, I said, not volunteering to fix it personally, not taking ownership of the crisis, just acknowledging that procedures existed for handling network problems. The distinction was subtle but important, the difference between being a resource and being responsible. At exactly 5 p.m. that day, I shut down my workstation and packed my laptop. The office buzzed with a different energy than usual, urgent conversations, people staying late, the controlled panic that happens when invisible systems become suddenly visible through their absence. Several people huddled around monitors discussing global tech's escalating issues while others typed frantically, generating activity that looked productive but couldn't substitute for actual technical knowledge. Peter looked up from his desk as I walked past, heading out already. The surprise in his voice was obvious. In his experience, I stayed until problems got solved, regardless of official working hours. I nodded. End of shift, I replied. He hesitated, clearly expecting me to mention the global tech situation, to volunteer additional time, to take responsibility for problems I hadn't created. I walked past the conference room where Garrett was on another call with global tech, his voice tight and controlled. Promising resolutions he couldn't deliver without expertise he didn't possess. Outside in the parking lot, my phone started buzzing before I reached my truck. One notification, then another, then another. By the time I started the engine, missed calls and urgent messages filled the screen like incoming artillery coordinates during a communications blackout. I turned the phone face down on the passenger seat and drove to Jake's school to pick him up for our Friday evening together. Basketball season was starting, and he wanted to work on his free throw percentage before tryouts next week. We stopped at the outdoor courts near my apartment, spent an hour shooting baskets while the sun set behind the industrial buildings that defined this part of town. Jake was getting better at focusing under pressure, sinking 7 out of 10 shots even when I called out random distractions to simulate game conditions. Reminds me of maintaining communications during incoming fire, I told him. You can't control the chaos around you, but you can control your response to it. Technical skills matter, but mental discipline matters more. That evening, instead of monitoring network alerts or responding to emergency calls, we ordered pizza and watched college basketball highlights on ESPN. Jake asked about my day, and I explained the concept of working to standard, doing exactly what your job description requires, nothing more, nothing less. In the Army, I said, we had clear definitions of responsibility. Everyone knew their role, their authority, and their limits. Civilian organizations sometimes blur those lines until people end up responsible for everything but authorized to control nothing. Around 9 p.m., after Jake had gone to his room to finish weekend homework, I finally checked my phone. 63 missed calls since leaving the office. Messages from Garrett, production supervisors, even some numbers I recognized from Global Tech's executive offices. I scrolled through the voicemails without listening to them. Each urgent request for immediate callback. Each escalating demand for technical intervention. Each assumption that my expertise belonged to the company regardless of official working hours or compensation agreements. I looked at the screen for a moment, then set the phone back on the kitchen counter and poured myself a beer. Saturday morning, Jake and I were planning to drive up to the state park for some trout fishing. My grandfather had taught me that patience was the most important skill for both fishing and troubleshooting. Sometimes the best response to urgent problems was deliberate inaction until people were ready to have rational conversations about solutions. That night, for the first time in 8 years at Bridgeport Manufacturing, I slept straight through without monitoring network alerts or responding to emergency calls. The problems developing at the office weren't my responsibility to solve outside normal working hours. They were documented challenges with documented solutions, waiting for people to read documentation instead of expecting personal intervention. Monday morning, walking into Bridgeport felt like entering a combat zone where the fighting had been going on all weekend without tactical coordination. The building hummed with frantic energy that wasn't productive work. People hurried between meetings carrying laptops and looking like soldiers who'd been awake too long trying to solve problems they weren't trained for. I passed two production supervisors near the coffee machine, voices tight with stress, global techs threatening to invoke the penalty clause. One said quietly, "The network keeps dropping their production data randomly. We're looking at 200,000 yen in daily penalties if this doesn't get resolved by Wednesday." Through Garrett's glass office wall, I could see him pacing while talking into his phone, gesturing at printouts scattered across his desk. Near the break room, several managers clustered around a laptop screen arguing over documentation they were trying to interpret. "That's not the right protocol sequence," someone said. "Then what is the right sequence?" Another voice replied with growing frustration. I walked to my desk and logged in at exactly 8 a.m. Same routine I'd followed for 8 years. For months, maybe years, the department had operated on an invisible assumption. Whenever something complicated broke, Marcus Thompson would quietly fix it without being asked, regardless of official responsibilities or working hours. Now, for the first time, the network was running without its hidden architect, and management was beginning to realize they had never actually understood their own infrastructure. The documentation I'd created was comprehensive, over 400 pages of network topology diagrams, protocol configurations, troubleshooting procedures, and emergency response playbooks. Everything organized with military precision, cross-referenced and indexed for quick access during crisis situations. But documentation only works when people read it, and reading technical manuals apparently wasn't something managers had time for during normal operations. Late that morning, an email appeared in everyone's inbox. "Emergency operations meeting, conference room A, mandatory attendance." I arrived exactly on time to find the atmosphere tense and strained. Several senior managers sat around the table with laptops open, documents scattered everywhere like battle plans that weren't working. At the far end sat someone I hadn't expected, Rebecca Foster, the operations director. She rarely appeared in person unless something had gone seriously wrong. Rebecca was different from Garrett. Former Navy logistics officer, understood the difference between management and leadership. She'd been brought in 2 years ago to straighten out operational inefficiencies, had a reputation for cutting through corporate politics to focus on results. Seeing her at this meeting meant the global tech situation had escalated beyond department level. Garrett stood beside the presentation screen, looking more tired than I'd seen him in years. Global tech has escalated their concerns about network reliability directly to executive leadership. He began clearing his throat. They're experiencing critical outages affecting production scheduling across multiple facilities. He clicked through slides, but the technical explanation quickly dissolved into vague summaries about connectivity issues and system instability. Rebecca listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small notebook. Finally, Garrett turned toward me. "Marcus," he said directly, "we need you to resolve the global tech network issues immediately." Every person in the room turned to look at me, expecting automatic compliance. I nodded once. "Of course," I said calmly. Then I added, almost gently, "but I thought others were more deserving of leadership opportunities and additional responsibilities." The sentence landed like incoming artillery. Complete silence. Garrett's jaw tightened. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, studying me with the quiet intensity of an officer reassessing battlefield intelligence. Without saying another word, I opened my laptop and accessed the network documentation I'd created over 4 years. For several minutes, the only sound was soft typing as I scrolled through hundreds of technical documents. Each file showed the same thing in the author field. Marcus Thompson, network architecture diagrams, Marcus Thompson emergency procedures, Marcus Thompson. Performance optimization guides, Marcus Thompson. Security protocols, Marcus Thompson. Rebecca watched my screen over my shoulder as I navigated through the documentation structure. She could see what everyone else had missed. Every solution that kept Global Tech's network running traced back to the same person. The one sitting quietly at the far end of the table, no longer volunteering unpaid expertise. I reached into my bag and pulled out a white envelope, placing it carefully on the conference table. The paper made a soft sound against the polished surface. "What's that?" Garrett asked, his voice tight. I slid the envelope toward Rebecca. My 2 weeks' notice. Several people straightened in their chairs. Garrett reacted immediately. "You're resigning," he said, voice rising right now, in the middle of this crisis. "I submitted it this morning," I replied. "Data Secure Systems contacted me last week. They're offering a senior security architect position overseeing critical infrastructure for defense contractors. The kind of work that values technical expertise appropriately." Garrett's frustration shifted into something closer to panic. "Marcus," he said more carefully, "this isn't the time to make emotional decisions. We can discuss compensation adjustments after we resolve the immediate crisis." I met his eyes. "This isn't emotional," I said. "This is a business decision based on professional development opportunities." Across the table, Rebecca still hadn't reacted. She opened the envelope and read my brief resignation letter. 2 paragraphs, professional, direct. She slipped the paper back and closed it. Then she looked at me. "Would you mind stepping into my office for a moment?" she asked. Garrett leaned forward. "Rebecca, we need him to fix this situation before." Rebecca raised one hand. The room fell silent. "Marcus, please," I followed her toward the door. Behind us, the room remained frozen because for the first time since the global tech contract began, the balance of power at Bridgeport Manufacturing had shifted completely. The person who understood the infrastructure held more leverage than the people who managed the org chart. Rebecca's office overlooked the production floor through floor-to-ceiling windows, much quieter than the tense conference room we just left. She closed the door and gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Please sit." I took the seat calmly. She remained standing for a moment, studying me like an officer reassessing battlefield intelligence. Then she asked the question directly. "What would it take for you to stay?" I didn't answer immediately. For months, I'd imagined leaving Bridgeport. Walking away had felt like the only option for career advancement. Now the situation was different. "I'm not interested in revenge or proving a point," I said finally. She nodded slightly. "Then what are you interested in?" I leaned forward. "Authority to build these systems properly," I said, and recognition that technical expertise deserves the same career progression as management skills. Rebecca walked to her desk and opened a folder she'd brought to the meeting. Inside was a document she'd already prepared. Someone had been watching this situation develop. She turned it toward me, Director of Infrastructure Security. I read the title quietly. "You'd report directly to executive leadership," Rebecca said. Then she pointed to a salary line that represented a 45% increase. "Full authority to redesign our network architecture, build a proper security team, and establish technical career advancement paths." I looked up. "It's a serious offer," I said. Rebecca nodded once. "It's also long overdue. We've been running critical infrastructure on the knowledge of one person. That's not sustainable or smart business practice." Over the next 6 months, the changes spread throughout Bridgeport Manufacturing. I assembled a real infrastructure security team, recruiting talent from places leadership had barely noticed before. A network technician who understood routing protocols better than most engineers. A systems admin who'd been buried in help desk work but could design enterprise-grade solutions. Together, we rebuilt the company's entire digital backbone. Networks became more resilient through proper redundancy. Documentation became comprehensive and accessible. Teams finally understood their own systems instead of relying on one person's expertise. Emergency calls dropped by 60%. System uptime improved to 99.9%. Even Global Tech expanded their contract, citing remarkable infrastructure reliability improvements. 8 months later, I was reviewing quarterly security assessments when my phone buzzed with a message from Rebecca. "Board approved your promotion to VP of Infrastructure and Security." I read the next line twice. Garrett supported the vote unanimously, not out of newfound respect, but because the results my team produced made the decision impossible to argue against. The infrastructure we built protected millions in revenue while creating career advancement opportunities for technical professionals who'd been invisible under the old system. Looking back, that 10% raise I'd once wanted would have changed very little. But the infrastructure security program we built changed everything for the company, for my team, and for technical workers who came after us. Here's what I learned from 22 years in technical roles. Your expertise has value, but only if you're willing to establish boundaries around it. Document everything you do. Then stop doing work that isn't officially your responsibility. When systems fail and management panics, that's when your true value becomes impossible to ignore. Don't let corporate politics convince you that competence should be its own reward. Demand the authority and compensation your skills deserve. The strongest response to being undervalued isn't anger or confrontation. It's making your worth so obvious that ignoring it becomes expensive. Sometimes the best way to help your organization is to stop enabling its dysfunction and force it to build better systems for everyone.